The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the grocery store bustled with its usual Monday evening chaos. Parents wrangled toddlers, teens scrolled through shopping lists, and carts rolled down every aisle. In the middle of it all stood Marcus, a tall man in his early 30s, well-dressed, calm, and quietly thumbing through apples, checking for bruises. A few feet away, an older woman in a sharp blazer was arguing with a cashier about a coupon that had expired. Her voice was rising, drawing glances from people nearby. As she stormed away from the counter, her eyes landed on Marcus, who was now reaching for a bag of oranges. She muttered something under her breath, loud enough for nearby customers to hear but soft enough to maintain deniability. A few heads turned. One woman gasped. Marcus paused, his hand hovering over the fruit bin. He turned to look at her, not with anger, not even with surprise, but with a calm curiosity that unsettled her far more than outrage ever could. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "Were you speaking to me?" She stiffened. "No. Just talking to myself." But the damage had been done. Everyone had heard. A hush fell over that section of the store. Marcus could have walked away. But instead he smiled. And then he began to speak. Marcus stood there, still holding the orange as he studied the woman, not with hostility, but with a quiet steadiness that made the air feel heavier. "I've always found it interesting," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "how some people confuse someone minding their own business with something offensive." A few shoppers stopped what they were doing. One man at the end of the aisle took out his phone, pretending to look at it while clearly listening. The woman scoffed, arms crossed. "Look, I didn't say anything to you directly, so I don't know why you're making this a big deal." Marcus nodded. "That's fair. You didn't say it to me. You said it at me. There's a difference." He placed the orange in his cart with a soft thud. "But here's the thing, I've spent years learning how to carry myself with dignity. My mother, who worked 3 jobs to raise me, taught me that real strength is quiet. That you don't need to raise your voice to be heard." Now more people were gathered. A young employee stocking shelves paused, frozen in place, eyes wide. Marcus went on, his voice unwavering. "So when someone throws words like yours into the air, hoping they land somewhere painful, I don't give them that power. Because I know who I am. I know what I've earned, and I know what I bring into a room." The woman looked increasingly uncomfortable. Her foot tapped. She avoided his gaze. "I've got a degree in engineering," Marcus continued. "I run a team of 25 people at a tech firm. I volunteer at a literacy center on weekends. And I'm here buying oranges for my niece because she likes fresh juice with breakfast. So, if me existing in your space is somehow offensive to you, I suggest you take a look at what that says about your peace of mind, not mine." The silence afterward was almost sacred. A woman near the bakery aisle let out an audible, "Wow." The cashier who had dealt with the woman earlier now stood at the end of the lane, quietly clapping. Marcus offered a final smile, not smug, not bitter. Just sure. Then he turned his cart around and walked away, leaving the woman standing there in a bubble of silence that felt 1,000 pounds heavier than it had before. As Marcus rounded the corner into the cereal aisle, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The weight of his words still lingered in the air behind him, echoing louder than any argument ever could. But what happened next wasn't about him. It was about everyone else. The young stock boy, barely 18, stood stunned for a moment before going back to work, but with something different in his posture. He glanced up at a passing customer, and instead of avoiding eye contact like usual, he nodded, a small gesture, but it felt meaningful. It was as if Marcus had cracked open something quiet and unspoken in the room. A reminder that confidence doesn't come from noise. It comes from knowing. The woman, meanwhile, had become visibly smaller. Not physically but in presence. Her posture had wilted. Whatever armor she had worn into the store had been peeled away, not by aggression but by truth. Sharp, clear, and undeniable. She slowly turned and pushed her cart away. No one followed. No one excused her. In a world where people often look away to avoid tension, this time they had watched. And remembered. Back near the checkout, a mother turned to her teenage son and whispered, "That's how you speak up without shouting." The boy, holding a box of cereal, nodded silently. His eyes hadn't left Marcus from the moment he started speaking. Another customer, an older man with a silver beard, approached Marcus just as he was picking up a carton of oat milk. "Hey," he said softly, almost cautiously. "I just want to say, that was something. You handled that with more grace than most people could ever manage." Marcus smiled, humble as always. "I wasn't trying to make a scene," he said. "I just wanted to leave the air cleaner than I found it." The man chuckled. "Well, mission accomplished. As Marcus checked out at the register, the cashier, a young woman with a warm smile, quietly scanned his items and leaned in just a little. "Thank you for saying what you said," she murmured. "Some of us needed to hear that today." Marcus met her eyes. "We all need reminders sometimes. Even me." He paid, thanked her, and walked out of the store into the early evening light, his bag of oranges rustling softly. He felt no anger, no bitterness. Just peace. Because moments like that aren't about winning. They're about standing firm without stepping on anyone else. They're about choosing dignity over pride, wisdom over reaction. And for everyone who had witnessed that moment, it was something they'd carry with them, through awkward silences, unfair glances, uncomfortable situations. A quiet voice inside reminding them, "You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stand." Marcus sat on the front porch of his townhouse that evening, a cool breeze brushing over his skin as the sky faded from orange to deep blue. The bag of groceries rested beside him. His niece's oranges were safe and sound, waiting to be turned into her favorite juice tomorrow morning. He leaned back in the creaky wooden chair, eyes following the stars as they flickered into view. The events of the day played in his mind, not in loops of regret or anger but in slow, thoughtful motion, like turning over a puzzle piece in his hand. He hadn't gone into that store looking to prove anything. He rarely did. Life had taught him that true strength doesn't need to arrive with a shout or a punch. Sometimes it arrives wearing soft words and steady eyes. But what stayed with him most wasn't the woman's comment. It was the silence that followed. The way people had stopped, listened, and absorbed. Not reacted with outrage or chaos, but listened. That silence had been louder than any apology. He pulled out his phone and opened his messages. A few texts had come in from people who'd been there, some he didn't even know personally. A couple of strangers had found his name from mutual friends. "You reminded me to speak up without burning down the room. I've never seen someone make a point so clearly without attacking. That was leadership." My son was there. He asked me why the woman looked so embarrassed. I told him it was because someone finally held up a mirror, and she didn't like the reflection. Marcus reread the last message twice. He'd grown up watching people either shrink or explode when faced with ignorance. But no one had taught him that there was a middle path, until life did. Until experience did. And now maybe he'd passed a bit of that lesson on. He thought about the woman again, not with resentment but with a strange kind of hope. Maybe she'd go home and forget the whole thing. Or maybe in some quiet moment she'd replay what he'd said and realize that the discomfort she'd felt wasn't from him, it was from within. And maybe that discomfort would one day bloom into change. He looked up at the moon, its light soft and full, like a truth that didn't need shouting to be seen. Inside, his niece called out from the kitchen, asking if she could help make the juice tomorrow morning. He smiled. "Of course," he called back. "We'll do it together." Because that was the thing about moments like today, they didn't just end at the grocery store. They rippled forward, through conversations, through generations, through small acts repeated with intention. And sometimes they started with nothing more than an orange, and a decision to speak, not to fight but to guide. 3 years had passed. The incident at the grocery store for Marcus had long folded into memory, not forgotten but no longer fresh. He hadn't spoken of it much afterward. It wasn't in his nature to chase attention. But what he never knew was how far the echo of that one day traveled. He was reminded of it on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Marcus had been invited to speak at a community mentorship event hosted by a local nonprofit. He occasionally volunteered there, helping young professionals find their way, resume building, mock interviews, leadership workshops. This time they asked him to share something more personal. A moment when staying composed changed the outcome. He thought about the grocery store. About the woman. About what he'd said, and more importantly how he said it. As he stood at the podium in a room of about 50 young men and women, he told the story, not to shame anyone, not to center himself, but to show the power of standing firm with calmness and clarity. When he finished, the applause was quiet but meaningful. Not the loud, obligatory kind. The kind that came with reflection. After the session, a young man approached him. Early 20s. Sharp eyes. Nervous energy. "Sir, do you remember a grocery store on 5th and Laurel? 3 years ago?" Marcus paused. "I do. I was there," the young man said. "I was stocking cereal. I was new, didn't really know anyone. I remember everything. You didn't yell. You didn't try to make anyone look bad. But the way you held the room, I've never forgotten it." Marcus's eyebrows lifted in quiet surprise. "I went home that night and told my mom about it. She said, that's what self-respect looks like. And I realized I'd been carrying a lot of anger, always expecting the worst from people. But you changed how I wanted to carry myself. The young man grinned then. Now I'm studying criminal justice. I want to help rebuild trust in places where it's been broken. Marcus shook his hand, firm, proud. But that wasn't the only echo. Later that year he received a letter. It was handwritten, the script careful, deliberate. No name. No return address. Just a brief message. I was the woman that day. You probably forgot me, but I haven't forgotten you. I didn't understand then why your words stayed with me. But I do now. You made me look at myself. Not the way the world sees me, but how I see others. And how that says more about me than I wanted to admit. I've done some work since then. I still am. But I wanted you to know, you helped me start. Thank you. Marcus sat with the letter for a long time. Not smiling. Not crying. Just still. There are moments in life that bloom quietly without announcement, and this was one. Meanwhile, across town, a young mother named Dana watched her son at the dinner table. He was 10 now, curious, gentle, often deep in thought. That day at the store had been his first brush with real discomfort, even if he didn't understand it at the time. But what he remembered wasn't the insult. He remembered the way Marcus stood. The way he spoke. And when he faced his own difficult moment at school, when a teacher spoke over him, dismissed his answer, he didn't raise his voice. He calmly explained his reasoning. Firm, clear, respectful. Later, when Dana asked why he didn't just stay quiet or get angry, he replied, "Because I remembered the orange man." Dana blinked. "The orange man?" "You know," he said, "the one with the oranges?" Who didn't yell. He just stood. And so the echo continued. Not in headlines. Not on social media. Not in viral clips. But in conversations. In choices. In the quiet spaces where people decide who they want to be. Because one moment of composure, one refusal to return a blow with another, can plant a seed. A different kind of power. One that doesn't shout or shame, but invites. And those seeds? They grow. The letter changed something in Marcus. Not because it vindicated him, he never sought that. Not because it proved he had won, there had never been a contest. But because it showed him what he had long suspected. That a moment handled well doesn't just end. It unfolds. That fall, Marcus returned to his usual volunteering, mentoring young professionals, offering career guidance, resume help, mock interviews, but he began to notice a shift. More of the young people who came through the doors didn't just want career advice. They wanted something deeper. How do I stay calm when people try to knock me off balance? How do I speak without becoming the very thing I'm standing against? How do I respond to disrespect without losing who I am in the process? The questions piled up, all circling the same unspoken theme. How do I carry myself with strength and grace, even when the world doesn't meet me halfway? Marcus realized that the moment in the grocery store had become something much larger. Not because people remembered him, but because people remembered the feeling. So he built something. He called it the Quiet Ground, a community space and mentorship initiative with a simple mission: to teach young people how to stand without striking, how to own their presence, how to find the strength in measured response. The name came from a phrase he often used when mentoring. If you don't know where to stand, stand on quiet ground. From there, your words carry further. The quiet ground wasn't flashy. No viral campaigns. No celebrities. Just a repurposed warehouse, some folding chairs, donated coffee, a donated printer, and a lot of lived wisdom. Workshops ranged from conflict de-escalation to storytelling, from public speaking to listening skills. But one session in particular became a staple: the power of a calm voice. Each time Marcus would start the same way. What you say matters. But how you carry silence before you speak. That's where the world leans in. Young people came. Then their siblings. Then their teachers. Then community leaders. They shared stories, not just of being mistreated or underestimated, but of how they responded. Sometimes well. Sometimes with regret. But always with a hunger to grow. One young woman, Eliza, shared how she'd been passed over for a leadership role in her student council. Instead of confronting the advisor in frustration, she scheduled a meeting, laid out her qualifications, and calmly asked what she could improve for the next round. The advisor later told her, "Your tone in that meeting, that's what changed my mind about you." She got the role the next term. Another boy, Jamal, recounted how a neighbor had accused him of loitering in his own apartment complex. Instead of reacting with fury, he had introduced himself, shook the man's hand and said, "I live here. Nice to meet you." Weeks later, the neighbor invited him to help with a local community garden. Stories like that flowed through the quiet ground like water through roots. Not loud victories but quiet ones. Steady ones. The kind that grow things. One evening, Marcus stood at the back of the room, watching a panel of former Ments now leading a session on conflict navigation. He didn't need to speak. They were carrying the message now better than he ever could. He stepped outside into the cool night air, the buzz of conversation still drifting from the windows. Across the street was a corner store, new management, fresh paint, but something about the aisle signs reminded him of that grocery store all those years ago. He smiled. Not because he was thinking of the insult, but because of the orange. The one he never got to juice that day. The one that started it all. He took a slow breath, then pulled out his phone. He opened his notes app and typed. Lesson 47, never underestimate a quiet moment. It may be planting something louder than you'll ever hear. Then he walked back inside. Because the garden was growing. And the ground was steady. 2 years after the quiet ground first opened its doors, something unexpected happened. It started with a podcast. One of Marcus's Ments, Eliza, the same student council leader who had once taught herself to respond with calm instead of anger, launched a weekly series called Stillness Speaks. It featured guests who had faced pressure, bias, misunderstanding, or conflict, and chose to respond with dignity, clarity, and a grounded voice. The format was simple, just a conversation and a question at the end of each episode. What would you tell someone who feels small, unheard, or unseen? By episode 12 they had 50,000 subscribers. By episode 23, they were being translated into Spanish, Swahili, and Japanese. And in episode 34, Eliza sat down with Marcus. He had avoided attention. He still didn't have social media. But she convinced him gently. They talked about the grocery store. Not to relive the insult but to highlight the pivot point. Do you remember what made you respond the way you did? Eliza asked. Marcus thought for a long moment. I remembered that my niece was waiting on me. For juice. For breakfast. For presents, he said, smiling. And I didn't want to walk through the door with bitterness in my pockets. So I chose peace, not because it was easier but because it was worth more. That episode was the tipping point. Soon, educators were reaching out. Schools wanted versions of the Quiet Ground curriculum. Libraries wanted to host listening circles. A youth center in Johannesburg painted a quote from the podcast above their door. You don't have to raise your voice to raise the room. A quiet revolution had begun. But it wasn't just the scale that mattered. It was the depth. A teacher in Nebraska wrote to say that her 5th grade class had adopted a pause circle each morning, where students shared moments when they handled a conflict calmly, and what it taught them. Kids began to reflect not just on what they did but how they showed up. In Tokyo, a company created an internal program based on the Quiet Grounds principles, helping employees navigate tense meetings with mindful communication. One executive wrote, "We stopped shouting over each other. We started hearing each other." And in Brazil, a former mentee, Jamal, opened the first international Quiet Ground Center. He named it Solo Firme, Steady Ground. Marcus visited it quietly. No media. No announcements. He walked in one afternoon during a conflict resolution workshop. Students were sitting in a circle, role-playing tense scenarios. A teenage girl stood up and calmly addressed her partner with clarity and patience, even when they pushed back. After the session, Jamal found him near the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching with pride. "You planted this," Jamal said. Marcus shook his head, smiling. "I just tossed the first seed." That night, Marcus returned to his journal. He wrote, Lesson 88, you never know what grows from a moment you didn't run from. By now the quiet ground wasn't just a space. It was an idea. A way of standing. A rhythm of responding. It traveled by word, by story, by silence. Not through noise or outrage but through calm conviction and visible integrity. And while Marcus never considered himself a founder of a movement, others did. But he stayed who he always was. He still made juice every Sunday morning with his niece. He still helped people one conversation at a time. He still believed the greatest change wasn't in platforms, it was in how people chose to show up, moment by moment, breath by breath. And so, from one quiet stand in a grocery store, a global chorus grew, not of shouting voices but of steady ones. Ones that said, you don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes the flame dies when it meets the ground beneath your feet. The sun was setting over the community garden behind the Quiet Ground Center. Rows of herbs, kale, and sunflowers swayed gently in the early autumn breeze. Marcus stood at the edge of the path, a watering can in one hand, his other resting on the back of a bench. He wasn't in a hurry. He rarely was anymore. He'd been thinking about something for months now. Not about stopping. He never saw this work as something you just walk away from. But maybe it was time to step aside. Not out of fatigue but out of trust. Inside the center, laughter bubbled from the main hall. Tonight's session was being led by Eliza and Jamal, two of the earliest students, now co-directors. The faces were different now but the heart was the same. As he stepped into the building he saw the familiar circle of chairs, a dozen new voices sharing stories, some broken, some healing. One girl, no older than 16, spoke with tears in her eyes about being misunderstood, labeled, overlooked. But she didn't speak in anger. She spoke in truth. Calm. Clear. The room sat still, hanging on her words. And when she finished, someone whispered, "That was strength." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. They were ready. A week later, the quiet ground held its first passing the voice ceremony. It wasn't flashy. No stage. No microphones. Just a circle as always. Marcus stood in the center, holding a small, carved stone with the initials QG etched into it, smooth, weighty, warm from his palm. "I've always said," he began, "you don't need a title to lead. Just a steady voice and a rooted presence." He looked at the circle, some old friends, many new faces. "This place was never about me. It was about a way of being. And now it belongs to you." He walked the stone across the circle and placed it into Eliza's hand. She didn't speak, just nodded, tears in her eyes.